Sometimes the smallest dreams are the ones that quietly change the biggest hearts. Snow drifted gently through the streets of downtown Chicago, covering sidewalks and rooftops with a soft white blanket while warm lights spilled from shop windows onto the quiet evening sidewalks. Holiday music floated through the crisp winter air, mixing with distant laughter as families hurried home carrying grocery bags, wrapped presents, and steaming cups of hot chocolate. It was the kind of evening people remembered for years, yet Ethan Brooks barely noticed any of it. At 42 years old, the white millionaire CEO had built one of the country's fastest-growing technology companies by believing that emotions slowed people down and kindness belonged in greeting cards rather than boardrooms. Every minute of his day had a purpose. Every meeting had an agenda. Every decision had a measurable return. His employees respected him, investors admired him, and competitors feared him. Very few people actually knew him. Wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal overcoat over an expensive navy business suit, Ethan stepped out of another successful meeting and adjusted the leather gloves covering his hands before checking the time on his silver watch. His driver had already pulled the black sedan toward the curb, but Ethan waved him ahead. 5 minutes, he said calmly. I will walk. The driver nodded without asking questions. Ethan rarely changed his routine. He walked with long, purposeful strides past glowing storefronts decorated with evergreen wreaths, strings of golden lights, and carefully arranged holiday displays designed to encourage shoppers to stop. He never stopped. His attention remained fixed on tomorrow's presentation, next quarter's earnings, and the endless list of responsibilities waiting on his desk. Then, almost without realizing why, he slowed. A small neighborhood chocolate shop stood quietly between a bookstore and a flower shop, its front window glowing with warm amber light. Inside, shelves overflowed with beautifully wrapped chocolate bars tied with elegant ribbons in deep red, emerald green, and gold. Most people passing by admired the display for only a second before continuing home. 2 little girls did not move at all. They stood side by side in matching cream-colored winter coats that had clearly been mended with patient hands more than once. Their knitted scarves were carefully wrapped around their necks, their boots showed signs of many snowy walks, and tiny snowflakes rested in their light blonde hair. They could not have been older than 7. They did not point. They did not knock on the glass. They did not ask anyone for money. They simply stood there in complete silence, looking at a single chocolate bar displayed on a small wooden stand beneath a handwritten sign that read, Handcrafted Holiday Special. Ethan glanced at them only briefly before preparing to continue walking. Children admired things they could not have every day. It was none of his business. But just as he took another step, the quieter of the 2 girls leaned slightly closer to the window, her blue eyes never leaving the chocolate, and whispered so softly that only someone standing nearby could hear, if we keep looking, maybe it will remember us. The second little girl smiled without taking her eyes away from the display. Maybe dreams wait too, she answered gently. Ethan stopped. Not because they had asked him for anything. They had not. Not because they were crying. They were not. He stopped because there was something almost impossible about the way they looked at that simple chocolate bar. It was not hunger. It was not envy. It was hope wrapped inside remarkable patience. For the first time in years, the millionaire CEO found himself standing perfectly still on a busy Chicago sidewalk, unable to explain why 2 quiet little girls staring through a bakery window suddenly felt more important than every meeting waiting for him tomorrow. For several quiet moments, Ethan remained standing on the sidewalk while people flowed around him like a steady winter river. Business executives hurried toward parking garages with phones pressed to their ears. Parents carried shopping bags while children laughed beneath colorful scarves. Couples paused to admire holiday decorations glowing beneath fresh snow. Yet the 2 little girls never moved. They stood shoulder to shoulder before the chocolate shop window as though the entire city had disappeared, their attention resting on a single beautifully wrapped chocolate bar placed beneath a tiny spotlight inside the display. Ethan checked his watch again, more out of habit than necessity. Every instinct urged him to continue walking. Tomorrow's schedule had already been planned down to the minute. Investors expected answers. Executives expected decisions. Time, in Ethan's world, was never wasted. Even so, his feet refused to leave. There was something unsettling about children who wanted nothing from anyone. They were not knocking on the glass. They were not asking strangers for money. They were not pointing or complaining. Their silence somehow carried more weight than any desperate plea he had ever ignored. One of the girls finally smiled, a small peaceful smile that seemed much older than 7 years. She gently tugged the sleeve of her sister's cream-colored coat. "It is getting late," she whispered softly. The other nodded. "Mom will wonder where we are." Neither sounded disappointed. Neither sounded angry. They simply accepted the moment as though admiring beautiful things from a distance was already part of their ordinary lives. Ethan watched as one of them reached into her coat pocket and carefully pulled out several coins. She counted them twice in her tiny gloved hand before placing them back inside with remarkable care. The second girl looked down briefly before quietly taking her sister's hand. "Tomorrow is fine too," she said gently. "Dreams do not disappear overnight." Ethan frowned almost without realizing it. He had spent years listening to financial forecasts, acquisition strategies, and market projections, yet somehow those simple words lingered in his thoughts far longer than any corporate presentation. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the little shop, its headlights briefly illuminating the girls' reflections in the window beside the glowing chocolate display. For a moment Ethan noticed something he had overlooked. Their matching scarves had been carefully knitted by hand. One had been repaired with pale blue thread. The other carried a tiny stitched heart near the edge where the fabric had once torn. Someone loved these children enough to mend every little thing instead of replacing it. A warm bell chimed as another customer stepped out of the chocolate shop carrying several expensive gift boxes tied with satin ribbons. The rich scent of cocoa drifted into the cold evening air before the door gently closed again. Neither little girl rushed toward the entrance. Neither tried to peek inside. They simply breathed in the sweet aroma with quiet contentment before smiling at one another as though that alone had been enough. Ethan found himself looking through the window instead of at the girls. The chocolate bar itself was elegant but ordinary, wrapped in deep red paper with a gold ribbon and a handwritten holiday label. It was the kind of purchase most customers would make without checking the price. Suddenly Ethan realized he had no idea what something so small might mean to someone who measured every coin before spending it. The sisters turned together and began walking away from the shop, their small boots leaving neat footprints across the fresh snow. Ethan remained exactly where he was, watching until they disappeared around the corner, and for reasons he could not explain, the carefully planned evening he had considered so important no longer felt quite as urgent as it had only a few minutes before. The next morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky that painted Chicago in soft shades of silver and blue. Ethan Brooks followed the same routine he had repeated for years. Before sunrise he finished a conference call with partners overseas, reviewed financial reports during breakfast, approved 3 acquisitions before 8 o'clock, and walked through his headquarters with the same calm expression that reminded everyone to stay focused. Employees greeted him politely. He acknowledged each one with a brief nod before continuing toward the executive elevator. Efficiency had become his language. Precision had become his identity. Yet somewhere between quarterly projections and shareholder meetings, a pair of quiet blue eyes kept returning to his thoughts. More accurately, for blue eyes. Every time he reached for another document, he remembered 2 little girls standing patiently before a chocolate shop without asking anyone for anything. He tried to dismiss the memory as meaningless, but it lingered with surprising persistence. By late afternoon, another successful meeting concluded, and Ethan found himself leaving the office earlier than usual. His driver noticed they were heading toward the same neighborhood as the evening before but wisely remained silent. When Ethan stepped onto the familiar sidewalk, gentle snowflakes had begun falling again, dusting benches, rooftops, and evergreen decorations with fresh white layers. Without fully admitting it even to himself, he looked immediately toward the chocolate shop. They were there. Standing in exactly the same place. Wearing the same carefully mended cream-colored coats and matching knitted scarves. Their tiny boots rested side by side in the snow while warm light from the display window reflected softly across their faces. Once again they remained completely silent. Ethan slowed his pace, stopping across the street where he could observe without disturbing them. Several shoppers entered the store carrying elegant gift bags before leaving with beautifully wrapped boxes tied in satin ribbon. The sisters never reached for the door. They simply admired the display as though it were a painting inside a museum. One of the girls quietly reached into her pocket and emptied several coins into her gloved hand. Together they counted each coin with remarkable concentration before arranging them into tiny stacks on the edge of the window ledge. When they finished counting, the older sister looked toward the bakery across the street where fresh loaves of bread rested behind another warm display window. She smiled gently. "Bread first," she whispered. The younger sister nodded without hesitation, carefully gathering every coin back into her pocket. "Dreams later," she answered with complete peace. There was no disappointment in her voice. No complaint. Only quiet acceptance. Ethan felt something unexpectedly heavy settle inside his chest. He had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet these children were calmly choosing between a loaf of bread and a single chocolate bar without allowing sadness to steal their kindness. A cold breeze swept gently through the street, lifting the edge of one little scarf. The younger sister noticed immediately and carefully adjusted it around her sister's neck before smiling. The older girl returned the gesture by brushing fresh snow from her sister's shoulder. They cared for one another with effortless tenderness, as though generosity had become their most natural habit. Ethan stood motionless, watching them walk away together toward the neighborhood bakery. For the first time in many years, the millionaire who had always believed every decision should be measured by profit quietly realized that the most valuable lesson he had witnessed all week had been taught by two little girls carrying only a handful of coins and hearts that somehow remained richer than his own. Snow continued falling gently as Ethan crossed the street toward the neighborhood bakery, his polished shoes leaving crisp footprints beside the much smaller ones the two sisters had made only moments before. Warm light spilled through the bakery windows, carrying the comforting aroma of fresh bread into the cold evening air. Through the glass he watched the girls step quietly inside, remove their knitted mittens, and patiently wait while other customers placed much larger orders. They never tried to move ahead in line. They simply smiled politely whenever someone walked past them. Ethan remained outside for a moment, almost surprised that he had followed them at all. It was not something he would have done a week earlier. Finally he opened the door, and the tiny brass bell above it chimed softly. The girls looked up for only an instant before returning their attention to the display of warm bread. Neither recognized him. Neither expected anything from him. The older sister carefully emptied the same small collection of coins onto the wooden counter while the younger sister counted beside her in a quiet whisper. Together they smiled when the total finally matched the price of one freshly baked loaf. The bakery owner, an elderly woman, with kind eyes, gently wrapped the bread in simple brown paper and handed it to them with a warm smile. "Fresh from the oven," she said kindly. The younger girl breathed in the comforting scent and closed her eyes for just a second. "It smells like home," she whispered. Ethan found himself smiling before he realized it. As the sisters thanked the baker and turned toward the door, they passed the chocolate shelf standing only a few feet away. The older girl slowed for a heartbeat, looking once more at the beautifully wrapped chocolate bar they had admired for 2 days. She did not reach toward it. She only smiled softly before taking her sister's hand again. Ethan finally spoke. "Excuse me." The girls turned politely. Up close they looked even younger than he had imagined, their cheeks pink from the cold, their blue eyes calm and remarkably gentle. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. The older sister nodded. Why did you choose bread instead? The girls exchanged a quick glance before the younger one answered first. Because bread helps today. Her sister added with a peaceful smile, chocolate is for celebrating. Ethan looked toward the shelf. So why not celebrate anyway? The older girl lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking with quiet honesty. We promised Mommy we would never spend money on wishes before taking care of what matters first. The younger sister nodded. Dreams taste sweeter when nobody goes hungry. Ethan stood completely still. Those words carried none of the bitterness he expected. There was no sadness in their voices, only quiet wisdom spoken with the simple certainty children sometimes possess. Before he could answer, the younger girl reached into her pocket once more and carefully removed a single copper penny that had not been included with the others. She smiled as she held it between both hands. I am keeping this one, she explained. Ethan looked at her curiously. Why? She glanced through the bakery window toward the chocolate shop across the street where golden lights glowed warmly against the falling snow. Because every dream deserves at least one coin waiting for it. For the first time in many years, Ethan Brooks found himself unable to think of a single business lesson that sounded wiser than the words of two little girls who had just chosen one loaf of bread over everything else they wanted. The sisters thanked Ethan politely before stepping back into the snowy evening, the warm loaf of bread held carefully between them as though it were the most valuable thing in the world. Ethan watched them through the bakery window for only a moment before quietly following several yards behind, making certain not to intrude. He did not know why he was doing it. Curiosity had never guided his decisions. Yet something about those children refused to leave his thoughts. They walked slowly through peaceful neighborhood streets lined with modest brick buildings, greeting nearly everyone they passed with cheerful smiles. An elderly man clearing snow from his front steps received a friendly wave. A woman carrying groceries was offered a warm greeting. The girls seemed to know that kindness cost nothing, yet somehow made every winter evening warmer. After several blocks they climbed the narrow steps to a small apartment building whose front hallway was decorated with handmade paper snowflakes taped carefully to the walls. Ethan remained across the street, watching as one little window on the second floor suddenly glowed brighter. Through the curtains he could see the outline of a woman opening the door before immediately embracing both girls. The sisters laughed softly as they held up the loaf of bread like children returning home with a great treasure. Ethan hesitated only briefly before quietly walking closer. The curtains had not been fully closed, and from the sidewalk he could glimpse a tiny kitchen with a round wooden table set for three. There were no expensive decorations. No elaborate holiday feast. Just three simple bowls, a steaming pot of vegetable soup, and a small candle burning gently in the center of the table. One sister carefully sliced the fresh bread into equal pieces while the other placed them beside each bowl with remarkable attention, making certain every portion looked exactly the same. Their mother smiled proudly. Perfect as always, she said warmly. The younger girl looked toward the empty corner of the table where a tiny glass jar held only a single copper penny. Ethan recognized it immediately. I saved the dream coin, she announced happily. Good, her mother replied with a gentle smile. Dreams should never disappear just because today needs something else first. The older sister quietly reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a tiny piece of paper that had clearly been carried many times. She showed it to her mother before carefully placing it beside the candle. Ethan could not read the words from where he stood, but he noticed a simple drawing of a chocolate bar surrounded by little stars. Their mother laughed softly. Still saving for that special chocolate? Both girls nodded together. Someday, the younger one whispered. Their mother reached across the table and squeezed both of their hands. Someday will come, she said with complete confidence. Not because chocolate changes life, but because hope keeps hearts alive while we wait. Ethan remained frozen beneath the softly falling snow. Inside that tiny apartment, where dinner consisted of soup, bread, and quiet gratitude, he witnessed something he had not seen inside boardrooms worth billions of dollars. No one complained about what was missing. No one measured happiness by what they could not afford. They celebrated what they already had. As the sisters bowed their heads for a brief prayer of thanks before the meal, Ethan slowly looked down at the expensive leather gloves covering his own hands. For years he had believed wealth was built by collecting more. Standing alone beneath a cold Chicago sky, listening to laughter drifting through one small apartment window, he began to wonder whether true richness had been quietly living inside that humble home all along while he had spent his entire life walking past it. The following afternoon, Ethan arrived at his office carrying more questions than reports for the first time in years. Throughout the morning, numbers filled conference room screens, executives presented ambitious forecasts, and advisors debated strategies worth millions of dollars, yet every discussion seemed strangely distant. Whenever silence settled across the room, Ethan remembered the little glass jar holding a single copper penny beside a candle. He remembered two sisters choosing bread before chocolate without the slightest trace of disappointment. By early evening, instead of asking his driver to return home, Ethan quietly requested one unexpected stop. The chocolate shop glowed warmly against the snowy sidewalk exactly as before. Inside, shelves overflowed with carefully wrapped holiday treats, each one polished to perfection beneath soft golden lights. Ethan stepped through the front door, and the rich scent of cocoa immediately surrounded him. The owner, a middle-aged woman arranging ribbon around gift boxes, welcomed him with a friendly smile. "Looking for a special gift?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the familiar chocolate bar displayed beneath the handwritten holiday sign. "I would like every one of those," he replied calmly. The owner looked surprised. "All of them?" Ethan nodded. "Every single one." A few minutes later, beautifully wrapped chocolate bars filled several elegant boxes. As the owner prepared the receipt, Ethan gently stopped her. "I have one favor to ask." She listened quietly. "The next time two little girls wearing matching cream-colored coats stop outside your window, please do not tell them who paid. Simply tell them someone already believed in their dream." The shop owner smiled with kind understanding. "I think I know exactly which girls you mean." Ethan hesitated before adding one more request. "If other children come here only to look because they cannot afford a treat, I would like you to keep doing the same." Quietly. No announcements. No names. The woman looked at him for several seconds before softly replying, "That may be the sweetest order I have ever received." The very next afternoon, the two sisters returned exactly as they always did, standing patiently before the glowing display. Ethan watched discreetly from across the street, careful not to interrupt. Before they could continue toward the bakery, the chocolate shop owner stepped outside carrying a neatly wrapped package tied with a red ribbon. "Excuse me, girls," she called warmly. They turned with surprised expressions. "Someone asked me to give this to you." The older sister blinked in confusion. "To us?" The owner nodded. "They said only one sentence. Someone already believed in your dream." The girls carefully accepted the small package with both hands. Neither hurried to untie the ribbon. Instead, they stood quietly looking at one another as though trying to understand how such unexpected kindness had found them. Finally, the younger sister opened the wrapping just enough to reveal the familiar handcrafted chocolate bar they had admired for days. Her blue eyes filled with joyful tears, not from sadness, but from pure gratitude. The older sister gently placed one hand over her heart before whispering, "Someone saw us." Ethan lowered his eyes, unexpectedly overwhelmed. He had imagined they would celebrate because of the chocolate itself. Instead, they treasured something far greater. For the first time in their young lives, they knew they had not been invisible. Standing unnoticed among strangers on a snowy Chicago sidewalk, Ethan quietly realized that generosity was never truly about giving people what they wanted. It was about letting them know they had always been worthy of being seen. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, and although the snow disappeared from the sidewalks, Ethan discovered that some habits were worth keeping. Every Friday evening, after finishing work, he quietly walked past the same chocolate shop before heading home. He never entered unless necessary, and he never allowed the sisters to see him. From a respectful distance he watched their familiar routine unfold. They always greeted the shop owner with warm smiles before continuing toward the neighborhood bakery where the scent of fresh bread welcomed them like an old friend. The chocolate bar no longer rested behind the glass untouched. Instead, another one quietly appeared in its place each week, waiting for the next child who might stop and dream for a while. Ethan had arranged everything anonymously. The shop owner alone knew the truth, and she faithfully protected it. One evening she called Ethan just before closing. "You should know something," she said gently. "The girls came back today." Ethan smiled faintly. "Did they enjoy the chocolate?" There was a brief pause before she answered. "They did not keep it." Ethan looked up from his office window. "What do you mean?" The owner laughed softly. "A little boy came in after school carrying only enough coins for a loaf of bread from the bakery next door. He stood looking at the chocolates the same way the sisters once did. Without saying a word, the girls untied the red ribbon, broke the chocolate into 3 equal pieces, gave the largest piece to the little boy, and thanked him for helping them celebrate." Ethan remained silent. The owner continued. "When I asked why they shared it instead of taking it home, the older sister smiled and said, 'Dreams taste even sweeter when nobody has to dream alone.'" Ethan slowly lowered the phone. Those words echoed through his quiet office long after the call ended. The following week he asked one of his trusted foundation directors to review several anonymous scholarship applications from the sisters' neighborhood without mentioning names or explaining why. He quietly arranged tutoring opportunities, after-school art classes, and community support programs that would benefit every child in the area rather than only one family. A local employment counselor contacted the sisters' mother about a flexible position restoring children's books at the public library, work that matched both her artistic talent and her schedule. She never learned who had recommended her. Ethan insisted it remain that way. Kindness, he had begun to understand, became stronger when it expected nothing in return. One afternoon, as he walked past the neighborhood playground, he noticed the sisters sitting beneath a blooming tree with sketchbooks balanced on their knees. Curious, he paused nearby without interrupting. The younger sister carefully colored a chocolate bar surrounded by tiny stars while the older one drew a loaf of bread resting beside it. At the top of the page she printed several neat words in bright blue letters. "Bread feeds today. Hope feeds tomorrow." Ethan smiled quietly. Months earlier he would have dismissed those words as sentimental. Now they felt wiser than many leadership books lining the shelves of his office. As he turned to leave, he slipped one small copper penny into his coat pocket, not because it held any financial value, but because it reminded him that every meaningful change begins with something almost too small for the world to notice. Sometimes it begins with one coin. Sometimes with one chocolate bar. And sometimes with 2 little girls who never asked for anything except the chance to keep believing in tomorrow. Years passed with remarkable quietness, and the little neighborhood slowly changed in ways that could not be measured by statistics alone. The old bakery remained on the corner, the chocolate shop still filled its front window with beautifully wrapped treats every holiday season, and children continued stopping there with wide eyes and hopeful smiles. Yet one new tradition slowly became part of the neighborhood without anyone knowing exactly how it had begun. Near the front counter of the chocolate shop sat a simple wicker basket filled with handcrafted chocolate bars. Beside it rested a small handwritten card that read, "If today feels a little difficult, please take one with love." No signatures appeared beneath the message. No company logo decorated the card. The kindness remained wonderfully anonymous. Ethan visited the neighborhood often, though rarely during business hours. Sometimes he stood across the street with a cup of coffee, quietly watching families pass beneath rows of flowering trees that had replaced the winter snow. He noticed children sharing chocolate instead of hiding it. He noticed neighbors greeting one another more often. He noticed that hope, once planted, had an unexpected way of multiplying. One sunny Saturday afternoon, curiosity led him into a small bakery he had never entered before. Warm cinnamon filled the air while fresh pastries lined polished wooden shelves. Behind the counter stood a young woman with golden hair gathered neatly behind her shoulders and bright blue eyes that carried an unmistakable warmth. She greeted every customer with genuine enthusiasm, carefully wrapping each loaf of bread and slipping an extra cookie into the bag of a young father buying breakfast for his daughter. Ethan recognized her almost immediately. Although many years had passed, he would never forget those gentle eyes that had once stared quietly through a chocolate shop window. Before he could speak, another familiar voice welcomed customers from the back of the store. The second sister emerged carrying a tray of warm rolls, laughing softly as neighborhood children rushed toward the display. One sister had become a gifted baker. The other had chosen to teach art classes in a bright studio built beside the bakery, where children painted butterflies, stars, bread, and colorful dreams across cheerful canvases. The walls displayed dozens of drawings signed by young hands, each one celebrating kindness in ordinary moments. Ethan quietly ordered a loaf of bread and prepared to leave without revealing himself. As the baker handed him the warm paper bag, she smiled kindly and placed a small handcrafted chocolate bar beside it. "That one is a gift," she said. Ethan looked surprised. "For me?" She nodded. "We always keep extras for anyone who looks like they have been carrying a long week." Ethan smiled, touched by the quiet familiarity of those words. Before he could answer, he noticed a tiny glass jar resting beside the cash register. Inside lay a collection of copper pennies gathered over many years. A handwritten label read, "Dream Coins. Every penny helps buy chocolate for another child someday." Ethan gently reached into his pocket and removed the single copper penny he had carried ever since that unforgettable winter. Without saying a word, he placed it carefully into the jar. The soft sound of the coin touching the others seemed almost musical. Neither sister recognized him. They simply thanked him warmly and wished him a wonderful afternoon. As Ethan stepped back into the sunshine carrying warm bread in one hand and chocolate in the other, he realized that the smallest dream he had ever witnessed had quietly grown into something capable of feeding an entire community with hope. Another winter arrived many years later, covering the neighborhood with the same quiet snowfall that had once introduced two little girls to a single chocolate bar behind a glowing shop window. The streets looked different now, brighter and filled with families who had made the little corner of the city famous for something far more valuable than shopping. People came for the bakery's fresh bread, the children's art studio, and the small chocolate shop where kindness had quietly become part of the tradition. Ethan Brooks, his hair now touched with silver, walked slowly beneath the twinkling holiday lights wearing the same calm expression that no longer reflected distance but peace. He had long since stepped away from leading his company every day, choosing instead to spend more time supporting schools, libraries, and neighborhood programs that encouraged children to dream without fear. Yet every December he returned to this street for one simple reason. He wanted to remember the place where his heart had first learned to stop rushing. As he approached the familiar chocolate shop, he noticed a young boy standing alone outside the display window. He could not have been older than 8. His winter coat was clean but well worn, and he quietly pressed his hands into his pockets while looking at a beautifully wrapped chocolate bar resting beneath the warm lights. He did not knock on the glass. He did not ask anyone for money. He simply stood there with the same patient hope Ethan had witnessed so many years before. Before Ethan could take another step, the bakery door opened. The two sisters walked outside together, now confident women whose kindness had only grown stronger with time. One carried a basket filled with warm bread. The other held several handcrafted chocolate bars tied with red ribbons. They noticed the little boy immediately. Without exchanging a single word, they smiled at each other with the quiet understanding shared by people who remembered exactly how a dream once felt from the other side of the window. The baker gently offered the boy a loaf of warm bread while her sister placed a chocolate bar into his hands. The child looked up in astonishment. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. One sister nodded with a warm smile. "Very sure." The other pointed toward the tiny glass jar of dream coins resting inside the shop window. "Someone believed in our dream once," she said gently. "Now it is our turn to believe in yours." The little boy hugged the bread and chocolate close to his chest, thanking them with a smile so genuine that it seemed to brighten the snowy evening all by itself. Ethan remained several steps away, watching quietly. Neither sister recognized the distinguished older gentleman standing beneath the street lamp. They never knew the name of the man who had first chosen to see them instead of simply passing by. They never needed to. Ethan reached into his coat pocket one last time and smiled as his fingers found nothing there. The single copper penny he had carried for years had already found its proper home inside the dream coin jar. Looking through the glowing shop window, he saw children laughing together over hot chocolate, neighbors sharing fresh bread, and a new generation learning that hope could be passed from one heart to another without ever becoming smaller. As soft snow continued falling across the peaceful street, Ethan quietly turned and walked home, knowing that the greatest investment he had ever made had never appeared on a balance sheet. It began with two little girls, one chocolate bar, one copper penny, and the simple decision to notice someone the rest of the world had almost walked past. And in the end, that small act of kindness became the sweetest legacy of all.